With Dave down to Dayton, Tennessee, and people peering in. And before I get into discussing that too much, I wanted to just kind of do a sense of the room here. How many people have heard of William Paley? William Paley. Okay, a few people. We'll talk about him pretty quickly. I think you were talking a bit, Scott, about the town celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial. And like I say, I want to get into that a little bit, but I wanted to prep it a little bit with some of the ideas. And William Paley, as you know, his books were still used in Cambridge University, his alma mater, into the 1920s. His books about modern theology and books about political theology and so on. When I say the watchmaker analogy, maybe that brings it a little clearer to some of you too, right? So he went to Cambridge. He was a very well-known writer. His talks and his ideas were still used and probably still are used. They were used in some of the trials that we talked about. They were mentioned in the Scopes trial. They were mentioned in another trial that we'll talk about a bit too. And his whole concept of theology was, imagine that you're walking down, and I've always heard at a beach, walking on a beach. Is that how you? He actually didn't say that, but he was talking about a heath, but I think it's been Americanized a little bit when we talk about it over here. But his teleological argument from design was written in Natural Theology, his book that came out in 1802. He had many other books. Feeling a little hot. I think I'm going to take my outer shirt off and go with my Darwin design here today. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone. I wish I could do this with an English accent, but and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had given before, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as the stone? Why is it not admissible in the second case as in the first? So that's an interesting point. Why can you kick a stone and think nothing much of it, but if you see a watch laying there, then certain thoughts and ideas and presumptions come to mind? This is in 1802 he put this book out, and as you saw earlier, he lived until 1805, so this is right near the end of his life. For this reason, and for no other, viz. That when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. That is, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried out on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it, right? So you can't say the same thing about a stone as you can say about this watch, and he's very cogently showing the difference between these two concepts, right? So this was very well perceived at the time, and then his next step from there came to be the inference we think is inevitable. This is on the first 3 pages of his book, right? This is page 1 and 2, and this goes on to page 3. The inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Okay? The argument from intelligent design, right? Creationism, that this is all This is what there was being fought and discussed and talked about for centuries, really, right? It was talked about in Dover and discussed and wrangled about, right? And in other cases from that too. And in fact, ironically, Paley went to Cambridge about 50 years before Darwin went to Cambridge, and ironically, they shared the same rooms. Darwin was in Paley's room. The books that Paley wrote were part of the curriculum at Cambridge. And Darwin came there in his youth, right, after spending about a year up in Edinburgh trying to follow in his family's footsteps of being a doctor and hating surgery and hating blood. And he went out to the shores of Edinburgh and he was talking to the fishermen there and looking at the different species that were there and so on. And he realized there was no way that he was going to become a doctor. His father thought the other thing that a gentleman of that time could do was become a clergyman, right? And clergymen, what was maybe the most appealing to it for Darwin at the time, in the 1825 or so, was to follow the amount of free time that you got as a clergyman. And a lot of clergymen were what they called natural philosophers, right? Before the word scientist was ever used. And they were looking for evidence in the world that proved the beneficence, the wonder of the universe, of the world, and of God, and so on. They were looking for facts that supported the presence of God. So they were collecting, he was famous at collecting beetles and things like that. He actually said a few things about, in his autobiography that was published 5 years after he died. He didn't allow it to be published while he was alive because it would have been too controversial in certain ways. But I did not at that time, this is Darwin talking, as a Cambridge theology student from 1827 to 1831, trouble myself about Paley's premises. In taking these on trust, I was charmed and convinced by the long line of argumentation. So he actually decided, he went on the voyage of the Beagle looking for ways to prove the wonder and beneficence of God and so on too, right? He was looking for natural stories that help portray the purpose of God in the universe. So he believed in Paley. He was educated on Paley. He read all of Paley's books. And he believed, and as most people did at the time, in this creationist type of idea. So this was Darwin in his youth. The old argument from design in nature is given by Paley, another quote from Darwin, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. Okay? So this is Darwin's actual work and development, and the things he spent his life and time studying helped him prove the fact that many others could not comprehend, that Paley was looking at things in a way that was supportive of a God, but really there was a whole other answer, okay? So I kind of wanted to get through some of those kind of concepts of really where Darwin was coming from as a youth and why he went on his trip and so on. And I have one other quote I wanted to read, and he said, "When I view all beings," says Darwin, "when I view all beings not as special creatures, not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled." Okay? So his whole impression of this is that the development and the understanding of natural selection and evolution and this process makes the world so much more interesting than just the fact that some creator designed a watch and left it for us to find and to work with and so on. So this whole idea, this whole concept fundamentally changed scientific views of the world. Okay. So with that, some level of background of what was going on, and this was 1859 was the publishing of The Origin of Species. And actually, Darwin had a lot of facts and evidence to back it up. He used ideas. He started out his whole book talking about artificial selection, talking about the things that farmers do or people do to raise cows and raise sheep and raise, his big one was pigeons. And he could talk about all the development and the capacity. He had a quote from one pigeon breeder who said that give him 5 years and he could make any pigeon that you wanted. So amazing kind of things that you look at that. So you used artificial selection, the concept of humans able to change the appearance of their animals to make them stronger, bigger, more colorful, more fancy or whatever. All those things were obviously able to be done by that, and then he went on to further concepts from there. So Scott and Dave were down at Dayton, Tennessee, at the Scopes monkey trial, 1925, 100 years ago. Worked through the summer, the hot summer of 1925. And you can see William Jennings Bryan is holding one of those fans in his hand. He was fanning himself constantly in the trial. And he's talking with Clarence Darrow there. So Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan contested the guilt or innocence of John Scopes, put on trial for teaching evolution to high schoolers. He actually, as Scott talked about, may not have actually done it. He agreed to be put on trial. That was supposed to be a pretty attention-grabbing device to get people to come to Dayton and to spend their money there and everything. And actually, WGN brought their broadcasting equipment down to Dayton, Tennessee, set it up in the courtroom, and broadcast the trial for everyone to hear. And that was way right up the alley of what the Dayton people wanted. They were pretty happy about that. Okay. So my thought was a nice follow-up to that would be a discussion of what science has produced in the intervening time to clarify and support this, all the facts behind evolution. Another anniversary is almost on us as well regarding evolution. Can you recall 20 years ago? It was 20 years ago right now the trial is going on. It started September 26th, so just a week and a half ago or so, and it went on for about 6 weeks. Okay. The Kitzmiller v. Dover Board of Education trial in Pennsylvania. Some creationists got elected to the Board of Education and got involved with the high school's purchasing of new science textbooks. Uh-oh. They glued a flyer in the new textbooks that said the following. They also wanted each biology teacher to read this to the classroom. So biology teachers were asked to read this to the classroom by the school board. Not asked, they were ordered. The Pennsylvania academic standards require students to learn about Darwin's theory of evolution and eventually to take a standardized test of which evolution is a part. Because Darwin's theory is a theory, it continues to be tested as new evidence is discovered. The theory is not a fact. Gaps in the theory exist for which there is no evidence. Intelligent design is an explanation of the origin of life that differs from Darwin's view. The reference book of Pandas and People is available for students to see if they would like to explore this view in an effort to gain an understanding of what intelligent design actually involves. As is true with any theory, students are encouraged to keep an open mind. So this ignited an educational firestorm, right? Two board members resigned in a show of disagreement with that. All science teachers refused to read it. And 11 parents in outrage filed suit. When you hear that, does it sound like, I don't know, amazingly in your face, kind of terrible? I mean, I don't think they meant it to sound that way. They meant it to say what we've heard for a lot of years, right? there's two points of view on these kinds of things, and let's teach the controversy, let's teach these kind of concepts. It doesn't sound like they're trying to be, but actually it was taken that way, and I would take it that way too. It's an unfair intrusion of a religious concept into a science classroom. Right? A conservative George W. Bush appointee, Judge John Jones, heard the case. The trial was not televised or recorded. In those days, federal trials were not allowed to be done except with very, very special purposes, and no one filed for it to be done. But Judge Jones said he wished it had been because it was so educational. He came in as a generalist about science. He knew what he knew, and he knew he was a conservative, went to church, and he had some leanings of ideas about religion and creationism and so on. But by all accounts, and you can actually hear Judge Jones talk nowadays. He's the president of Dickinson College right now in Pennsylvania, where he went to school, and he describes it as a rout. Some of the things he said, the prosecution was canny and well prepared. The defense was lackluster. The star scientist for the defense admitted that his definition of science was so broad that it could actually include astrology. If they are going to define religion the way, or define science the way he wanted to define it, you could say astrology was a science. The Pandas and People book that I mentioned there was a lot of look into that, and it was actually a cut and paste job. A creationist book in which the word creation had been replaced with multiple errors at different times by the phrase intelligent design. At one point in the book, they said something like it was Kerr intelligent designationism. They inserted it in there instead of replacing it. So 5 days before Christmas, 20 years ago, Judge Jones handed down his decision in favor of evolution. I remember that day. I don't know if some of you, science teachers, Joanne's nodding her head. Yeah, there was a lot of concern about what would happen. If people wanted to say this, let's be reasonable, let's teach the controversy, let's let the kids hear both sides. There's an American sense of fairness to all that stuff, right? Right? But he handed down his decision. He didn't mince words, ruling that the school board's policy was one of breathtaking inanity and that the defendants had lied when claiming they had no religious motivations in what they were doing. So again, I have a little bit of, this is a great book if you have an opportunity, Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne, and there's some parts in here I'm borrowing from. It is our view, said Judge Jones, that a reasonable, objective observer would, after reviewing both the voluminous record in this case and our narrative, reach the inescapable conclusion that ID, intelligent design, is an interesting theological argument, but that it is not science. In summary, the school board's disclaimer singles out the theory of evolution for special treatment, misrepresents its status in the scientific community, causes students to doubt its validity without scientific justification, presents students with a religious alternative masquerading as a scientific theory, directs them to consult a creationist text of Pandas and People as though it were a science resource, and instructs students to forego scientific inquiry in the public school classroom and instead to seek out religious instruction elsewhere. Jones also brushed aside the defense's claim that the theory of evolution was fatally flawed. To be sure, he said, Darwin's theory of evolution is imperfect. However, the fact that a scientific theory cannot yet render an explanation on every point should not be used as a pretext to thrust an untestable alternative hypothesis grounded in religion into the science classroom to misrepresent well-established scientific propositions. Hooray! That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And it is. I just listened to Judge Jones talk for an hour on a YouTube blurb, and he was fantastic. Just the things he said. He talked about growing up and and how he became a lawyer and why he became a lawyer and how all those things contributed to listening to things fairly and seeing both sides to realize you're not the expert, but you're to judge the validity of what people say. And it was very good. So, if we're going to discuss evolution, we probably need to start with a sentence or a concept that clarifies it and what we think it intends to mean. I thought for a while we could get together and talk about that a little bit and try to come up with it. And do you have ideas of what should be said in a statement about evolution? What words should be said in there? That's working.
Well, actually, before I talk about that, do you know the origin of the phrase "teach the controversy"?
No, not really.
It was specifically, here, I looked it up because I remembered something about it, and I was like, all right, let me make sure I get the details right. So it was a campaign started by the Discovery Institute.
Yeah.
And the Discovery Institute was this specifically very conservative think tank that was basically the reason why evolution or creationism became a thing again in the early 2000s, is because they were pushing it.
Right.
And so like the whole idea of teach the controversy was them astroturfing this idea.
Right.
But anyway, as far as
What concepts or thoughts should be in the in a statement about evolution?
well, I thought about this one time of like, not to get too off onto a tangent, but there's this quote from Feynman that says, if only one piece of knowledge lasts, if we could pass it down, it's that matter is made of atoms. And I was trying to think, how would you sum up evolution as a single simple phrase like that? And I think it would be, all life is a single line or a single ancestry.
Okay.
Maybe is a way to put it.
Yeah, a common ancestry is an important part of this. All of life is based on a
Something
common
about
ancestry.
change over time?
Change over time.
Are you familiar with PragerU?
Yeah.
I mean, they're putting out a whole bunch of videos, and I think some of the conservative school districts are looking to incorporate them.
Right, yeah, PragerU is a creationist or a conservative type of well-funded thing putting out. I know I've heard it talk more about their talks about Columbus and the wonderful things Columbus did and that slavery was not so bad. People learned a lot of skills by being slaves and so on. Yeah. So that's, there's people trying to define it and to try to grab it, and that's why you have to be careful about all these concepts, right?
The problem with teaching the
Controversy?
right, having them equal, they're not equal. And so, like, one's here, so teaching the controversy is not an equal proposition.
Right, if evolution has all these facts and knowledges to back it up, and they don't want to talk about that, right? You don't hear them debating and discussing, and they come up with certain points. I know, I think Ken Ham is a creationist person from Australia, actually, and he engages in debates, but he'll generally only engage in debates with people that aren't generally debaters all the time. So this is a guy that's debating 200 times a year with different people, and he has his points. I've heard stories of how things that he's said in front of people have been proved wrong during the debate, but the next debate he has with the next person, he brings that same point up again, right? Because it's a valid point in people's minds that want to be fair or whatever, and he doesn't care if something has been proved wrong. The facts don't mean anything to him. He's wanting to win debates. So he's debating against people that don't debate regularly. I think he's the one that debated the science guy, Bill Nye, the science guy, and there was a lot of discussion. Should you really debate this guy because he's not a fair debater, right? You know, you can't bring facts that aren't true into a debate. think Scott has something he wants to say in back.
One of the magazines I collected down in Dayton when visiting the Scopes anniversary had an article in it that said that Kim Ham and his Discovery Institute and the ARC experience in Kentucky, they brought in $35 million in donations the week after that debate.
Yeah.
So regardless of an intellectual assessment of who had the better arguments, it was a tremendous success from a certain standpoint for the Discovery Institute.
Money-making endeavors, right. All right. So if we talk about it, I think we talk about common ancestry. We talk about a long string of life moving on based on that. I put up something here. This is, again, borrowed from Jerry Coyne, who's a professor in biology at University of Chicago. And I've heard him talk and discuss things too. Life on Earth evolved gradually, starting with one primitive species, perhaps a self-replicating molecule, that lived more than 3.5 billion years ago. It then branched out over time, throwing off many new and diverse species, and the mechanism for most, but not all, of evolutionary change is natural selection. Okay? So that takes a common ancestry thing in there too. And it actually, if you start breaking it into parts, Jerry Coyne breaks it into 6 parts, this statement. It's a long sentence. It is nice to have a sentence that's short and sweet and to the point. But he sees 6 components of evolution versus evolution itself, that life gradually changes over time, that there's mutations and changes and things that go on that make things proceed. It's a good point to talk about one of my favorite books, Richard Dawkins' The Ancestor Tale. He tells the story of, it's kind of based on the Chaucer's tales, the Pilgrim's Tales, what is it? Canterbury Tales, right? And he tells a story of looking back in time and lining up each ancestor, each predecessor of an animal. He uses a rabbit, you can say. So you look at a rabbit, and then you put its mother in a line there. And if you could go back in time and just as a thought experiment, line up the mother of each animal going back and back and back and back and back. And the things that you can see when you look at that is that each mother looks very similar to its mother, right? And each daughter looks very similar, right? You don't see enormous changes, right? So there's this gradualism to evolution. But if you look back and back and back and back and back, at some point there are some odd, slight changes in some ways, right? And you go back, and he talks about the hairpin turn. And he's using it to describe maybe a rabbit and think of a cheetah, let's say. At some point, each of those, if you look at a cheetah nowadays and a rabbit nowadays, and you look back, the mothers of each one moving back and back and back and back in time, at some point, they had a common ancestor, which is intellectually understandable, but it's hard to visualize, right? How did these creatures change so slightly, such a little bit, yet still remain true and pass things on? And come back to this point where he calls it the hairpin turn, where there's one individual that was the predecessor of rabbits and the predecessor of cheetahs, right? Just phenomenal when you think of it, especially since I think cheetahs would like to eat rabbits. But you go back and you can do that for anything. And his story, the Ancestor's Tale, he finds something like, I think, 27 hairpin turns that he thinks are significant. And he sees humans, and he sees chimpanzees. There was one common ancestor at a point that was the predecessor of both, the ancestor of both. And he goes back further, and he sees other great apes, and he goes back further, and he sees other mammals, and he goes back further, and he sees reptiles. At some point, we and a snake had a common ancestor, right? And you can go back and back and back and back and back, and he takes it back. It's a very interesting story to read. If you have an opportunity, I suggest it very highly. It's a great thought experiment to follow through with there. So that's an interesting, important aspect of this all. Gradualism, this time that it takes to do it. There's been things that have been found out recently that can talk about evolution, and we've talked about it in here at times. The finches on the Galapagos, how they've, due to climate changes, they've had different beaks, different food sources, and they developed certain birds with a beak that wasn't susceptible or wasn't proper for feeding on the new types of grains that grew there, or nuts or seeds or different things would die off, and others would replace them, and so on. Yeah. But there's this gradualism that takes much, much time, and when you think of how a rabbit and a cheetah can have come from the same ancestor, there's obviously a great amount of time involved in all that. Oops. Speciation is incorporated in this statement too, that because these animals all get isolated from each other, if you imagine one mother gave rise to 2 offspring and something caused them to become separated, right? They could become separated by distance. One could end up on a floating mass of logs or something and grass that ends up on an island, and the other one stays on the mainland. Or one can take a travel around a mountain and be in a whole different environment and be separated from the others. There's something that separates them and causes them not to interbreed anymore, right? Which causes this speciation. Species develop that are different, have something different. We see speciation occurring where horses and mules cannot breed and have a fertile offspring. They only have sterile offspring. So burros are not a species. Well, there's a species. They're not able to interbreed anymore. I did it backwards? Mules are the sterile ones. Thank you. Common ancestry, which is the other side of the coin of speciation. If things speciate, if things branch out, then you have to be able to look back in time and see that they were part of a common ancestry, right? And so what you look for as a scientist, the scientist will look for things that show this. If species come about and if there's a world in which these things are occurring, then that's a sign of evolution being evident. And this is the thing that really stood out, Darwin's concept of why evolution takes place or why things happen. Evolution was talked about for many years before Darwin came about, but natural selection was his significant addition. He found the mechanism for how and why evolution takes place. So when you have natural selection, when you have certain animals able to pass on their genes more readily to others, then their good traits will go on. Darwin was confident that this was happening. He had no idea at all of the means of how it happened, right? There was no understanding in Darwin's time, except by one monk in Austria, right, that understood genetics at the time. So genetics was the real key that helped support these concepts, and it wasn't understood until really, even Mendel's work was hidden. No one really read it until about the 30s came about. So that's not that long ago. And in here, Jerry Coyne feels it's important to talk about non-selective methods of evolutionary change, which are things like genetic drift or just things that aren't really natural selection, but maybe certain animals have quite a few offspring in a species and others don't. And because that happens, then their traits pass on even though it's not naturally selective, right? It didn't make them, it could be a color change or a different thing like that. Sometimes a color change could very well be naturally selective when light-colored, white-colored rabbits do well in the polar areas and so on. But sometimes there's just changes in species that aren't really adapted. There's mutations that occur, and then the species has a slight change to it. But they can evolutionarily change, even though there was nothing really involved with natural selection in it. So those are his 6 components of it. And I think they help kind of define what we're looking for as we talk further on. So if we think about modern ways, post-Darwinism, or post-Darwin, to talk about this, none of these aspects were really available to Darwin, or were available in very limited ways. If we go back to the first slide a second here, I had something on the right, a cladogram. So this is interesting description of different aspects of life, and these are points at which speciation took place, or different groups broke off into different areas. When did these kind of tree of life start? Can anyone think of examples of them?
Right.
What's that?
RNA.
RNA. Way before RNA was known about, in the Origin of Species, there's a small, the only really little sketch that Darwin made. He made a small sketch. It showed the tree of life. You may have seen it. Okay, I didn't bother to put it on here. It looks similar to this. So he did it in the 1800s. He was describing in his notebooks what he thought happened. All right. The famous person involved in making these tree of life kind of things was Carl Linnaeus. The Linnean description of life, and it's 1735 is some work that he did that categorized, right, put things in different categories. John, you had something?
I want to say it's the current tree of life. I mean, we've had 5 extinctions, and each one, I would believe, created its own new tree of life when things evolved after that.
I think I'd add to that original, each of those extinctions killed off many of the things in those trees of life, but they kept going. A branch of it started out again. There were new ones that were created. I would say that it's a scientific debate, whether it's a new tree of life or a continuation of a destroyed, mainly destroyed tree of life, right?
I believe, but I think we had mammals with dinosaurs, but they were very small. And it wasn't until the dinosaurs left that bigger mammals were created and come into existence.
Were they created or did they evolve? Okay. I would say that we'd have to be careful. We think of created, and we have to be careful with that word. My take on that, John, I'm not disagreeing with your points. My take is that I don't think it's a different tree of life. I think it was a continuation of the tree of life that had been severely hacked off, right? 95% it could be of life died, but that other 5% that was still there, again, flourished, developed.
And
I'd like you to have to look into it, but I would think a lot of things that existed when extinct didn't come back.
Oh, definitely.
And so,
John is saying that he thinks a lot of things that existed years ago before the 5 major extinction periods did not come back. And that's the story of life continually. something like 95% of all the creatures that have ever, all the species that have ever lived on the earth have died off, have become extinct. And that's another concept of how does that fit in with creationism? How would an intelligent creator make things in which 95, 98% of the things that are created have no purpose and die off in the course of the life of the earth?
Right. One of the missing points, I think, on this is that it's based on climate change. I mean, we've been pretty stable for the last 15,000 years, and we didn't see visibly a lot of evolution, especially in the bigger things happen. But as the climate changes, then different things have a better chance of surviving, and things change.
Things
So
have to adapt.
Without some change, what exists is top notch, because nothing can overtake it. But when the climate changes and something else comes up, then all of a sudden they get eliminated.
Right. I think climate change is a big impact on extinction events. I think a lot of other things, a giant meteor coming in can have a big impact on it. But yeah, things have to adapt to their environment, and when they can't, then they die off, right? And that can be a climate change event, and it can be meteors, it can be quite a lot of different things.
But I was saying, even with the climate change slightly over time, it promotes evolution.
Definitely.
Where if it's stable, you don't see much evolution.
Right, and sometimes it's how well fit a certain individual species is to the climate that they're in. There can be a minor little change of a 1% change of calcium in the seawater or something like that, and it can kill a whole variety of different small plankton and things like that. And other animals aren't susceptible to it all. It has no impact on them. So it's what's there for each species, right? We better move along. So my point here about these graphs and trees of life and so on, they show something that helps support evolution. For example, if you had to, if I brought in 200 matchbooks here, anyone ever collect matchbooks when you were a kid? That kind of died out, right? Yeah. And when you collected little matchbooks, if you did, or you can imagine doing that, if we had 200 thrown out here on a table in front of you, do you think that your method of sorting those and collecting them, you might sort them by, what's one way you might sort? Color? Color? Okay, so you might put all the red ones here, and the green ones here, and the blue ones there, and so on. Someone else might do it by the country that they were made in, right? The country of origin. So I'm going to put all the German ones over here and the Russian ones here and so on, right? Is one more legitimate than the other? Is one a... It's just... And if you'd put 30 people in trying to adjust and adapt and make a collection of that, you would get 30 potentially different ways of sorting and collecting matchbooks, right? But there's something that goes on when you start sorting and arranging species, right? You can sort things that are plants, right? That's a very valid way, and you can support things that aren't by the ways you do it. And that could be done by just appearance. You start looking closer and closer and closer, and you might even be wrong sometimes, because there's sometimes creatures that look very much alike that really don't have much of a common history. But they appeared to do that for you. But basically, Linnaeus and all these people, they found that when they did this in Sweden, where he was from, when they did it in America, when they did it in England, and they did it in France, biologists came up with fairly identical means of splitting and organizing species, right? And that's because there's a natural order to it. There's a natural progression of what to do. And that progression tends to follow evolutionary life, right? That things that are much more similar to each other aren't. What do we have now that helps us do this that wasn't around for Darwin?
DNA.
DNA testing, right? And when you find the DNA testing that was done and has been done, now we can get genomes of entire species, right? And they can get the genome of species, and you see how many of the DNA areas combine or match up or similar or so on. How similar is it to what Linnaeus did in 1735, would you say? 20% accurate? Probably like 95% accurate. There's some errors in places, like I said, when there's things there, but the way that Linnaeus decided and described, he put trees in different groups. He has plants and animals and trees, and there's ferns and so on, and all those, he sees a lot of ferns that are alike. All the species that he did, there's a great similarity that tends to go along. Probably technical scientists and biologists and botanists would say, well, here's where Linnaeus was wrong and here's what wasn't right and so on. But for the most part, it follows along because it's a logical way. It's not as scatterbrained as collecting and organizing matchbooks would be, right? That you can't go and say, this is the proper way to organize and collect matchbooks. So, if we want to talk about, I'll get back to my modern ways to verify evolution. Discerning evolutionary relationships between animals from DNA sequences, like Joanne mentioned. That was not available at all to Darwin. But what we do supports the thoughts and the concepts that Darwin came up with. There's not much that is in here that throws anything out of the books of what Darwin said. There's corrections, there's assumptions that were made at times that need to be changed somewhat, but this is evolution. When we started looking at DNA sequences, it basically proves the basic concept that we were talking about in that statement I made. There weren't a lot of fossil finds prior to Darwin's time. There were a good amount, but there have been so many more in the preceding years. Darwin thought that fossil finds were not a very strong point of his proof of evolution. He didn't think that there was enough evidence. He thought it didn't prove it as much as it could. Core samples we'll talk about too. When you take mud that was laid down in the Cambrian period over tens of millions of years, laid down and gets compressed and turned to rock. Nowadays, people can go to those areas, Cambrian areas in the Burgess Shale in Canada, or there's a lot of Cambrian mud in China, and you can core sample. They can go down linearly for hundreds of feet and pull out a core sample. And they can look at these, and the mud was actually comprised of small critters, right? Little planktons and different things like that. And then they can start looking through, slicing each of these and looking at the time. And as you look at the different plankton, they can find, and the trilobites and different things like that, they can look through these things and they can see change over time, right? They can do things like count the gill structures in trilobites over tens of thousands of years. They can see the rise and fall of the amount of populations of different types there are. They can actually see genetic change, evolutionary change over time in these core samples. It's an amazing thing. At microscopic levels, they're counting how many gills this creature had, and then 10 million years earlier, how many gills it had, and 10 million years prior to that, how many it had. So amazing things like that. Other amazing fossil finds are like the Archaeopteryx in Germany that they found. A feathered reptile, right, with teeth, which birds don't have, and feathers, right? And so they're getting a lot more knowledge about all that kind of stuff too. They're finding, people always used to say we need to find the missing link, right? And the missing link, there's all sorts of jokes about that. They want to have a crocoduck or something like that, partly. If everything's got a common ancestor, you got to have something that looks partly like a crocodile and partly like a duck, Well, no, that's not how it works, you know. There were preliminary features of this animal, and some branched off into one and some branched off into the other. In one of the most recent Senate races, there was a Senate candidate that said, if humans were descended from monkeys, how come there's still monkeys around? It's like, because they had a common ancestor and they evolved into two different parts. It's a simple answer, but people don't want to hear that and understand that that should stop them from saying that again. The entire field of genetics. Gregor Mendel actually, there was supposedly in Darwin's library, there was a couple of references of people sending him things about genetics. But Gregor Mendel wasn't that interested in publishing. He published in a very obscure German journal, and Darwin didn't read German, so there was no real interplay with that. But imagine if those two had been to a seminar together or something like that and sat down, what would have come from that? But the entire field of genetics, as you look at how things pass on and so on, how things go from there. I mean, Darwin knew certain things. He knew about pollination and things like that, but understanding genetics and the strength of dominant and recessive genes and so on, all point towards support of this. So to go in a little bit of detail on some of this, this is talk about the olfactory receptors. Linda Buck and Richard Axel were Nobel Prize winners in 2004 for their work studying olfactory receptor genes, you know, the capacity to detect smells, right? If you start looking at that, what's the function, I guess, what's the value of an olfactory receptor gene, or the genes that let you do that?
It stinks.
Do what?
It stinks.
It stinks. Yes, there's...
It's determining the difference between rotten fruit and ripe fruit.
Mm-hmm. So if you think about one of the most capable of smelling animals, the olfactory king, would be a mouse. Mice have about 1,000 active olfactory receptor genes that often work in combination with each other. So it could be using 17 different genes to work together to identify a certain smell. They detect food, predators, kin, they find a mate, they patrol territory, and many, many more things. Humans have about 400 active, but many hundred more are inactive genes. Right in your DNA, there's genes that don't perform. They're non-functional genes, right? But if they're there, why would a creator put non-functional genes in humans that very much line up with what's in mice, right? Many things the same, just one letter changed in the DNA, right? An A for a C or a T for a G or different things like that. And a small change like that can make a whole string of of receptors non-functional. And then if you bring it to the main point, dolphins have hundreds of inactive OR genes, no active ones really. Waterborne chemicals are detected by other genes. So they've developed a whole other way to detect what's important to them in the water, right? They have genes that do that mice don't have at all, right? So that's 3 different mammals with a whole variety of different capacities in terms of their olfactory capabilities, right? And that's a pretty good example, pretty good proof of what happened. How did mice get so many olfactory receptor genes? They're basically repetitions of what was one initially, or a few initially. And sometimes the genes duplicate themselves. They make whole big paths of them. Imagine a long ago mouse that had, instead of 5 olfactory receptor genes, those all doubled and they had 10. And they were able to scent out things a little bit more carefully. What would evolution say would happen to those mice? They would survive. They they would be better fit to live in that environment, right? They could detect smells better, and they could be more able to escape danger and things like that. And so that progression of genes, that development of genes, resulted in over 1,000 active OR genes in mice. And humans had a common ancestor with mice, so at some point when we were scrabbling around, like you said, John, in the times of the dinosaurs, right? We were probably part of an organism, a common ancestor that probably had a lot better smelling capabilities than we have, right? Most larger animals, he's saying, were eaten, so only small ones would be around, and it would be a benefit to them to be able to smell better and to detect things, right? Until the dinosaur steps on them, right? So yeah, humans would have evolved from an ancestor that had many more active OR genes. Those OR genes, as we don't need them so much, they've become defunct, they've become non-functional, and it doesn't hurt our survivability, it doesn't hurt our capacity to survive, so we go on, right? And it hasn't hurt our capacity to survive. Dolphins don't need them at all, and they're completely wiped out in dolphins, okay? Other interesting ones. These are some of the amazing fossils I talked about. This is, all of these are different animals living at different times in the past that are kind of shown by the blue to white line there. Humpback is still alive now. The others have all become extinct. But all these were animals that had a genetic structure and a structure that evolved into whales. So these are early ancestors of whales. This was a land-living animal. 4 legs, a tail, running around, right? 50 million years ago. Not much later than that, this came along, starting to elongate a little bit. More buoyant animals. 40 million years ago. Where'd the back legs go? And down to the humpback whale that was evolved 34 million years ago. Have you seen skeletons of whales anywhere? Pictures of them or skeletons of them? I think I have some here. These are some of those same animals. Hind legs, turning more into flippers. And in these, all of these are extinct animals, but these aren't even attached to the skeleton structure anymore. And you can find that in common whales nowadays. The skeletons of whales have the remnants of hip and leg bones in them, right? Much reduced. What creator would make a humpback whale and decide to put tiny little hip bones and things that are completely non-functional and non-usable in there? Evolution is the only thing that really can describe this. We've talked a couple of times about the animal, Scott mentioned it 2 weeks ago, Tiktaalik, which was a transition species between water-living fish and an animal that could come out on land. And we talked about the bone structure of that. All these animals have 1 bone, 2 bones, lots of bones, right? But they can turn into almost anything, right? Why would a creator make all these things like that and make them different in different animals, but all have a same common structure? Evolution, again, solves that issue as well, too, right? The Tiktaalik animal had become more elongated finger bones and digits. It was able to do, it was called able to do push-ups. Evolution lets you make certain predictions, and those predictions should be able to pan out. They're pretty hard to find. We talked about man that found Tiktaalik. He said, well, I want to find an animal that was alive 380 million years ago, because we found an animal from 395 million years ago that's pretty much a fish, and we found one from 370 million years ago that was up on land by then. So he knew what rocks to look in, what rocks are at the surface around the world. He actually took out his college geology book and looked for where rocks from that age were. They found in Ellesmere Island, Canada, and they spent 7 years going up there for a very short summer looking for this animal, and after in the 7th year they finally found it exactly where they thought it should be, right? Pretty amazing when you think of that. Okay. All right. So those are some of the facts of evolution I wanted to bring up. I could talk forever about this. I could probably break it into small portions of it and talk about it forever. I think I wanted to show some of the core samples in here that showed some of the long-term changes in small plankton and different things from Cambrian times. And a few of the books I'd highly recommend. The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins is a real joyous kind of answer to Paley's discussion, and talks about what kind of watchmaker would have to be to do what really happens in evolution. Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. And I had a couple of others too that I wanted to talk about. I guess I didn't. Oh, there they are. Richard Dawkins, The Ancestor's Tale, we talked about a little bit, A Pilgrimage to the Dawn of Evolution. And one of his greatest books with a lot of good pictures, Richard Dawkins, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Yes? Bob?
Going back to the hairpin effect,
Yeah.
you know, where you've got a mother and let's say 2 offspring, and one of them ends up going in one evolutionary direction, the other in another, right?
Right.
So I would assume in that first generation they're not separate species yet. They can interbreed, and what keeps them from just muddling back together into something else?
And that can happen. I mean, it's very difficult. That's why it's very difficult to find and say this animal here that we found in this rock is the last common ancestor, because it was so similar to the ones before it and the ones after it. It could be that for a few generations they split off and they were separated from each other, and then they come back together again. But then this wouldn't be the last common ancestor. At some point, we can intellectually say, as a mind experiment, as a thought experiment, that there was a last common ancestor, but to define it and say exactly what it looked like and what it was different and what was different about its 2 offspring, as you say, they could have been identical twins, right? They could have been, but something occurred that was something environmentally, chemically, some action occurred, something occurred that separated them. And it had to happen, or we wouldn't have what we have achieved, right? And it happens very rarely, too. That's why it's so gradual. Speciation is so gradual. But as they branch off, these two could have interbred. Maybe for thousands of years they could have interbred even. But they didn't. And when they didn't, it could be that of these 2 populations, some of this population came back over to the other population, but something kept true. I mean, that's the amazing thing about evolution. When we look at what a success each one of us are, you look back to your mother, to your mother's mother, to your mother's mother. We have been evolutionary successful for 3.5 billion years, right? Us, you, me, each of us. I mean, and that's phenomenal. And the speciation that occurred from that is something that could have occurred intentionally. It could have occurred mutationally. It could have occurred physically by getting on a floating raft and going somewhere. But something happened at multiple times, but not very often. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna mention things like, so I don't know a whole lot about this, but so I don't know how much we know about like how big of an effect these are. But like, there are 2 terms that I've heard the founder effect and punctuated equilibrium. Have you heard these two terms? Like the founder effect is basically like you've got a large population and then a small population, subpopulation splits off and kind of interbreeds with itself and has no interact with the main population. And that's one way that you can get speciation. And it can be geography, it can be that some environmental thing causes almost all of the population to die off except a few. It can be, all kinds of things. And,
I mean, if you think of plants,
yeah,
plants can have some slight mutation that causes them to pollinate at a slightly different time. So those two plants wouldn't be able to interpollinate anymore because they're just at different times and cycles. That could be somewhat in animals too, that they just choose not to interbreed with some for some reason. You know, it could be political. It could be personal. They just don't want to interact in some way and there's so many possibilities that it's fascinating.
yeah. And the other thing I've just been thinking is just that it's all basically just the law of large numbers. It's just the idea that like the most likely thing to happen is the thing that happens the most, right? And so the most likely species to survive is the one that survives the most, right?
Yeah.
I might point out that amongst Europeans, we have about a 3% of Neanderthal, and if you look at the Oriental populations, you find 1 to 2% of Denisovan. So we're talking about, again, speciation and then becoming non-speciated, except we still have the remnants.
Yeah. Question? All right, well, thank you. I know that it's nice to have some basic thoughts when people want to say, well, this just doesn't fit in with my way of looking at things. And you say, well, your way of looking at things can be wrong, you can tell people too.
Wrong? We could be wrong?
So I wanted to get to some of the aspects of evolution that kind of struck in my mind when Scott was giving his talk a couple weeks ago. So thanks a lot for coming in. I had a fun time with this. And 2 weeks from now, Mark Ailes is going to talk about climate change. And I think the Green Sanctuary is going to talk about food choices in early November. So thanks so much, and try to get some of those books.